Okay.
No, you need to talk.
Right.
You need to talk louder.
All right. So anyway, we just want to thank you for coming. So tonight we're gonna, I want to introduce some people that will be speaking tonight. So I'm John Weesey. I'm a board member here for USD 457. This is Mike Dominguez. He's the superintendent here at USD 457. We got Robert Schwartz and Jenna Wallace with RSP that will be presenting. They're from the consulting firm that we hired to kind of help us walk through this. And I just want to, like I said, I just want to thank you all for your time. I appreciate you coming. It's a process. We're in the beginning stages of it. Nothing's set in stone. These are just drafts. So I just want to encourage you guys to soak in what they're presenting tonight. And as a board, this is a very student-driven board, a community-minded board. And at the end of the day, we're going to slow down and make the right decision for our school and for our community. And I just want you all to understand that it's not going to be a fast and quick decision. We're going to slow down and try to make the right decision for the community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and he'll do a little bit more.
I think this mic is a little louder. I'm going to have to pull it back a little bit. Dr. Mike Dominguez, good to see you. I'm the superintendent here. For some background information, I'll just let you know we've had 4 before yesterday evening RSP meetings, boundary studies, and then the committee that we called and invited. There were 46 members, not counting the leadership team. We added 8 more invites, so definitely over 50 individuals as far as the committee. If you're a committee member, now the vast majority showed up yesterday, so they may not be here this evening. If you are a committee member that served and have been to all 4 or 3, 2, 1 of those, go ahead and stand for us right quick just so they can see who was a component of those meetings. So you can see they're standing around in all the leadership. Drew Tone is to my right. Drew Tone is the Chief HR Director. He's been at all of them. I myself have been at all of them. Jessica Northern is here. She's the CFO to my left, and Josh Guyman is also to my left, is Assistant Superintendent, and he's been at all of them. So when we start doing some table work, if there's some questions, we may or may not have the answer because there's a great deal of what ifs with this planning, but we just trying to give you some linear data or linear information of how we got here. The boundary study, the one, if you know, north of town, east of town, northeast of town, we're growing so much that there's been, in the old term, called a force out. We don't like that term. We try to do overcapacity transfer. So there have been overcapacity transfers from Jenny Barker for quite some years. It's full to its degree, and then they get to go somewhere else to school. So looking at the boundary study, needed to maybe reflect and do another boundary study. That is how the committee started. The last boundary study was in 12 and 13. That year is roughly when this high school opened up, a beautiful school, and the boundaries were set. Sometimes those boundaries, you need about a 7-year rotation, not a 10-year rotation. The committee, per board request, the committee when they met, it was strictly a boundary study. It's kind of grown from there, but was to look at fiduciary duty, the money spent, the capacity of the buildings, the feeder patterns, the transportation that it would take, safety and security with the different buildings. Some are different and older buildings than others, with capacity trying to get to an ideal of 75 to 85%, and that was with RSP and board's input on that to the committee. Projected enrollment moving forward was thought about licensure for teachers and HR. Like I said, Drew's HR person. We want to recruit, retain, and keep the most qualified teachers. And sometimes the model we have now, which is a K4, intermediate 5-6, middle school 6-8. In that first meeting, the committee was asked what model could and would be better if there were a change. And K4 was an option, leave the intermediates like they are, and the middle schools like as they are currently as a 7-8 model, or to go a K5 model, absorb the intermediates, and then give a 6-8 model with 2 middle schools or 1 middle school. The committee, by voting, and that was committee members that are here can attest to that, voted, that was just the information given, thought the K-5, 6-8 model could and would be better. I think that was from a study in 2019. We had a boundary study in 2019 here. I don't see Karen Merle here. Was anybody else on that committee meeting in 18-19 school year? Well, that's fine. But Karen Merle was here. I see one hand back there in the back. So the beginning of that, they looked at the model and thought maybe going back to a K-5 model may be advantageous for the students, for the teachers, and for the district as far as the usage of the buildings. And per Ms. Merle, COVID hit, and then we just kind of stopped moving forward with that. We had the boundary input meeting yesterday evening. That's the 17th. Today's the 18th. We'll give you a lot of information on that and hopefully get you some input. There's a survey. They're posted around and they'll be on the board later that you can fill out and give input. We also have April 22nd, and that's called a board retreat. So the board will meet one more time to try to configure the last thoughts. And technically, the committee meets on May 2nd, which is supposed to be the last one. As John Weesey, our board president, alluded to, may have to reflect on the actual time frame of that and moving forward and do our due diligence when we make any decisions that have these kind of ramifications. So apart from that, I think I'm good, and I'm going to hand it to Rob Schwartz. Any clarifications?
Monica needs to talk.
Yes, correct. So Monica needs to talk, and go ahead and have Dika and Albert come over here too, if that's okay. So Monica Diaz.
Stop meeting on the 22nd, open to the public.
Board retreat is open to the public this week.
That's Monday night at 5:30.
6 o'clock. Board meetings are at 6. It will be at the ESC Center, and it will be live streamed. Roy, is it going to be live streamed? And Roy's shaking his head yes, so it will be live streamed also. And that'll be 6 o'clock, April 22nd, which is Monday. And here's Monica Diaz.
I just wanted to explain, after the presentation, you all will be working in table groups. There are numbers on the back of the tables in the back. So there's Post-it notes on those tables for comments. You can put those Post-its on poster paper, and those will be collected at the end of the night. There's green and red paper at those tables as well. So if you have green showing, that means your table's okay. You're doing well. If you have red up, then we know you have a question and someone will go to your table and answer your questions or give you some support. I also wanted to mention that we have some translators here as well. So I'll let them explain the table work directions as well. We've got Lupita and Susana here in Spanish, so if they'll come up. Then we've got Albert coming up, and he will translate in Korean and Burmese. And then Dika will come up, and she's here to translate in Somali.
Buenas tardes. Al final de la presentación van a hacer unas actividades y están unas mesas atrás. Mesa 1, 2, 3, 4 y 5 van a ser en español si necesitan ayuda para traducir.
galab wanaagsan table 21 ay fadhiisanayaan dadka luqadda Soomaaliga ku hadla sidoo kale anaa ku caawin doona hadaa wax su'aalo u baahan tahay.
ကျွန်တော်နာမည် El Baba တကယ်လို့ဗမာလိုစကားပြန်လို့မဆိုရင်စပွဲနံပါတ်25 24ကိုလာပေးပါယနေ့မိတာဝဲဘာညောစကားပြန်ဘောမီလိုဒါမစီယောနေသူဝိသဆွေဟဲလေစပွဲနော်ဤခီစီလူခီစီတပ်လို့
In English, tables 1 through 5 will be in Spanish, and Somali, tables 21 and 22, and Karen and Burmese, 24 and 25. So thank y'all, and we'll hand it over to Rob Schwartz from RSP.
Thank you, Dr. Dominguez. I was told to remind everyone, if you want to speak after the conversations that are ensuing, come up here to pick up a pink form so you can be put in that order. All right, as indicated, I'm Rob Schwartz, the owner of RSP and Associates. I'm very familiar with your community. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. You get a benefit this evening. Last night we didn't have the PowerPoint able to be shown until after I was done speaking. So you're going to get a little bit more information tonight that I think is imperative to the context of why we're talking about what we're talking about this evening. So a little bit about RSP. I told you we were here in 2013 when this building opened, and we set the attendance boundaries. We work exclusively with school districts. Jenna has been running each of your meetings for the committee level and doing the presentations to the board. She will speak after me to talk about how did these concepts evolve. So let's dig into some things. We have a lot of work that you're going to help us with tonight. Tonight is one of the most important parts of this process. You will see on all of the maps to your left and right, there's one key word that's on each of those maps, the word draft. And that's important for you guys to understand. Your inputs will shape how much we change with some of the items that we're going to talk about. You're going to learn a lot of things tonight, things about the population, things about the economy, residential, student enrollment, capacity, and how that's used in your buildings, some of the conditions and needs, the financial outlook, some of the programming, and then some of the solutions that are kind of being driven by all of those particular elements. I want to have a brief stopping point with what we've seen with population. So this slide provides you where we've been in 2000 and then where we potentially go in 2028. A lot of our conversation with the county and city has been with uncounted persons. So if you're familiar with the 2020 census, people that didn't complete the long or short form are in your community. And so this is one of those benchmarks. Everyone uses census data, but we know that there's some uncounted persons in your community. We know there's some really cool economic indicators that are happening beyond empirical foods. Things that when you drive around, you see other shopping opportunities, and what that means for your community is very important. When we look at residential development, this is one of those factors that you have to take in stride with what we've built and then what the city and the EDC are having as goals. We'll talk about that. We build 1,000 units per year. If we built 1,000 units per year, could the local economy have the tradespeople there? So last night I spoke about, hey, is there national builders that are going to come in? Why is that an important factor? Today I was over in Dodge City because we know a national builder came in and built about 300 homes. The way they were able to do those 300 homes was a national builder because they didn't have the tradespeople. So again, here's what we've seen with development in your community, and so you get to make a decision. Are we going to build 1,000 units per year? Is it going to be more in line with what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years? Or is it going to be somewhere in between? When we look at enrollments, I want you to understand that just because our population may be growing, it doesn't equate to necessarily student enrollment growth. During this time period where we've seen enrollment decline, we've built almost 500 plus units, but we've declined. There's other things happening in this community. There's things that are being driven by the type of population and how many children and how long they might be waiting to have children. A lot of demographics. Building capacity and utilization. This is always an interesting conversation because even in buildings, as I talk through this slide, that are underutilized, if you have students in those buildings, you're going to say, hey, we're using all of those spaces. The key thing is, are those spaces being used as intended, specifically for core classroom instruction? So as we look at this slide, what we're highlighting, if we do nothing, so this isn't anything with the concepts, As we come down each of those buildings, we show the grades that are there. We show the number of sections or tracks that would be related to each of those buildings. So you get a sense of who's the 1 section, the 2 section, the 3 section, what the capacity is. This is a lower capacity. There's an even higher capacity that you could have for each of these buildings. But we're using the lower capacity because the district feels that's more in line with the functional capacity. So how the programs operate in these buildings. So as we go through each of these buildings, each of those that are listed in green are underutilized, under 70%. Why is that a key number? So RSP, we've been doing this for 20 plus years. What we typically see in buildings when we get below 70%, you start to do different things in those buildings that will not be optimal. It might be that you share art or some other counselor or some other use with other buildings. You might go from full-time to just part-time persons in those buildings. So as we look at this, when you start to understand there's only one building that was over capacity in our study, that was Jenny Barker. Each of the buildings that are underutilized, not only are they under 70%, there's many of them that are under 60%. This became one of those elements that when we look at the process, we started out, let's do an enrollment study. Let's figure out what's happening with the enrollment, because we were hearing mixed things about, look at all this building activity, look at all these economic indicators, we should be growing. We're not seeing that with the number of students. I showed you that in the previous slide. So as we worked through this, it became a process that instead of saying, hey, well, let's move some of the areas that are in town going out to Jenny Barker, let's move them into, let's say, VO, and we would be done, and nobody would probably be here this evening. As we looked at this information, I can tell you it was deja vu for me. I went back to 2013 notes, and guess what I saw in 2013? A lot of these similar conversations about our inventory that gets into the condition of the inventory, the size of the buildings, how we move our students around to some of these buildings. Very similar themes, a little bit different because the enrollment is lower here in 2024 than it was back then. So just giving you a sense of that capacity is pretty critical. So some of the things with the conditions and needs, you've heard or you've discussed things that need to be done in these buildings. I've heard a lot of conversation that the building we're in here today, the decision to build it, had some negative implications on how much money you can spend on some of the other buildings. Probably a true fact. But here we are in 2024, we have to do some things differently with our inventory. So this ties into some of the financial tracking of information that the district's going to be providing over the next few weeks. Some of the things that I can start to give you that we have had conversations with administration is about how they're staffing the buildings. And so right now we have about 170 classified and certified staff that are not filled. So that has a lot of impacts on what services are happening in the buildings, how the students are receiving the educational modeling. This is the way we meet some of our budget constraints. If you don't fill the position, you're not paying for the position. So it gets into some of this utilization. Some of the conversation started to ensue about the grade configuration. What kind of came out of these meetings is very much limited support in the intermediate buildings. And so in the conversations, and Jen will get into how this kind of worked through the process, there was growing contentment and consent that a K5, 6, 8, 9, 12 is the best grade configuration for kids. And what that means is we start to think about equity in each of the buildings, whether it's a small building, a larger building, a rural setting, or one that's right here in the city. Some of the conclusions here that help you maybe understand some of the components of how this is difficult. Most of the projects before COVID, we would just deal with one situation. Hey, we're changing a boundary, there's too many kids, there's another building over here that doesn't have enough kids. Draw a boundary, done. That's not the case of what this this situation is that we have here in Garden City. And that's how this process evolved. We started out, enrollment analysis, do a boundary study, let's fix Jenny Parker. And it now moved into there's more things that we need to look at. It's an opportunity to plan for what may be inevitable in the future with financial challenges. And I can tell you this is everywhere across the state of Kansas. Every district we work in, they're always talking about financial challenges. So some of the things that you see in these plans roll into going to K5, 6A. We already have 912, so we're not talking about that. Consolidation of building inventory to better utilize our resources. You heard from Dr. Dominguez, you heard from the board member about the fiscal, financial, fiduciary responsibility of the board. So if we have these buildings that are being underutilized and we're seeing some challenges in how we can operate those buildings, because there's investments that need to be made in those buildings, they're saying we may have to do something different. We want to implement efficient enrollment distribution across the buildings. This starts to get into who are the kids in each of those buildings and what type of kids, and is it right to send one group of students to one building and another group to another building? Some really deep, hard conversations. Also conversations about programming. So some exciting things in the draft proposals of expanding our early childhood and being able to provide some of the programs that you may have in one building and not have in another building. You might get some more equitability in what that looks like. And then also that then starts to dive into some of the allocation of funding and staffing. The key thing here, bottom line, this would be implemented, whatever it may look like, in the 25-26 school year. That gives one school year to work through all of the different details on how this may impact your families and how you can start to make some of those solutions. I'm going to be handing this over to Jenna here in a moment, but I wanted to kind of go back to some of my notes of what I had for goals for all of you. And so I had 3 goals for the meeting last night, and they're still the same tonight. And the first is to provide a safe environment for everyone to engage in a civil conversation. We understand we've worked through so many processes where we're closing buildings, and we know it's personal. There's no way I can tell you that I have empathy or can sympathize with your situation. This is real for all of you. But you have to understand, we get that. So we want to have a safe environment for people to have conversation and vent, discuss what your situations are. The second is to assist you all in knowing how the data and the committee has worked through that data to get to the creation of the concepts. I will tell you 100% certainty there are committee members here who don't like some component of what is being presented tonight or may feel like something should be presented differently. And that's where we're going to talk a little bit more when Jenna comes in about how we evolve to what this looks like. So again, assisting you in knowing what's happening. The third is that we would allow you to have multiple formats to provide your input. The first is here in public. The second is going to be in a public input that you can sign up for and give your comments and narration. And the third, which for our team we find the most important, is the MetroQuest survey that is in English or Spanish. And it opened yesterday and it's open through the 30th. That is very crucial to our understanding of how you might be thinking about some of these things. I also wanted you to take away from all of this of thinking about, is the juice worth the squeeze? So where I told you there's a multitude of things that are being discussed in this option. So think about how, if we do something that we have an ideal number of buildings, and let's say fewer buildings, how do we feel about that? If in these concepts we're eliminating one-section schools, so these are city schools, we have 2 city schools, and then we have 2 rural schools that we've been talking about with this one section. And some of them become one section or not able to be one section when we go to K5 when they're K4 buildings. Thinking about the ideal school size. Is it smaller? Do we tailor some things because of different types of student needs? So maybe smaller buildings are needed. Changing the grade configuration. Going to one middle school. How does that work with a lot of kids in one building versus two buildings? Changing the attendance areas. How many students we're impacting? Close to 50% when we look at this. And then how do we make future investments in the building? So the last thing I wanted to leave you with, a little bit different than what I did last night, is that I want you guys to get a sense of when we looked at what could happen in this community with developments. We had to make assumptions just like you have had to make with what is going to happen in this community over the next 5 to 10 years. And so we answered the question of what happens with development a little bit differently. One of the things that we looked at is what trades are available in your community if we were to build 1,000 units. Could the existing trades do it? Our answer was no. If we're going to build 1,000 units per year, we're going to need some assistance. Do we have commitments if we're going to be building that from national builders like Pulte or D.R. Horton? Again, not advocating they come here, we have good builders here. But if we're going to build that many, we need more resources. What's happening with the infrastructure, sewer, water, and roads? Are there final plats being approved? We've worked in many communities where if you're building 1,000 units a year, it's a mini city in different places of your community. The last piece of that, economic opportunities that bring families that will have school-aged children. What are we seeing with some of the job opportunities? And I've already showed you what we were seeing with some of these things. Lastly, and that's all yours, Jenna, I want you guys to be thinking not about how this necessarily impacts you, because with your board and with your administration, they're having to make decisions for the entire district. So that has a little bit of a different lens. Most of our conversation last night, and I expect tonight, is going to be probably a little more negative about how this is personally impacting you. And we want to hear that. But as we talk about getting to the solutions, we're going to be talking more about what that student experience could look like. We know what it looks like right now, but with this change, we have to make it better. And what this means is we have to focus on every student. So not just a rural student, a city student, a small school student, a large school student, or English language learners, or special education. Every student, all students. And that's kind of the perspective that RSP has come at this. I look forward to your comments. Jen's going to take you through some of the stuff that gets you to that level. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. All right, everyone, my name is Jenna Wallace with RSP. I'm going to really briefly talk through some of the data that went into these concepts and that the committee has had the 4 different meetings really to chew on. I'll be pretty brief with all the different slides and know that all this information is out on the district website, and you guys can feel free to dig in deeper to any of those different variables. This first is the enrollment analysis overview. So leading into what our study found in our December analysis that looked at the 5 years of enrollment data. The different variables I'm going to talk through, I'll come back to this 100,000 foot perspective. We have the district decreasing over these next 5 years, but the majority of that decrease at the high school level, with elementary and intermediate enrollment expected to increase. We'll talk about capacity, and then we'll talk about how housing and the economic outlook have led to a future growth model of elementary students and a decrease at the high school. In this analysis, we have all of the current boundaries formulated into the data, so we know how many students reside in each boundary and where they attend. We'll talk about the intermediate boundaries, and so for students in a K-4 elementary school, they would have their 5-6 programming at the intermediate schools, versus if you're in a K-6 school, you would maintain that boundary until 6th grade. Currently in the system at 7th grade, the students come together in the middle school map, so this is a boundary that distributes 7th and 8th grade between these 2 schools. In our forecasting model, this one slide really breaks into the methodology and the accuracy of the model, and it's called a planning area map. So part of RSP's job is to analyze the district in small building block items. So if you think of one neighborhood or one subdivision, This is what we're analyzing. We can accurately show how many students live in each neighborhood, what's the housing type, if it's multifamily, mobile home, single family, and what is that individual relationship with a student yield rate. And this gives us the ability to say, if we draw the neighborhood differently in an attendance area, if we added grade, what does that mean for the number of students in the building in future years? So all the information in the projections, we always put this slide in here just to illustrate it is a statistical model, right? So it's based on all the best known information that we can pull together and creating the most likely forecast for future years. And you can kind of think of the model like a lever. So we have some variables in the community that lead to enrollment growth. So new housing opportunities, new jobs, population, which would be indicating enrollment growth. But then we have other variables that are leading to enrollment decrease, which could look at cohort loss or outmigration of students. And what the model is doing is taking all those variables and evening them out to be the most likely forecast. So depending on your scope and which variables you're looking at, we can lead into how that contributes to a most likely elementary, high school enrollment. One of these first variables that we do look at is our live birth rate data. So this is illustrating by the state the number of live births in Finney County. This is reported by Kansas Department of Health based on the address of the mothers giving birth. So it's not by hospital or by anything like that. It is a statewide database that looks at all the addresses. And so what we can see here is we have been seeing less live births per year, correlating with a smaller kindergarten class. Something we're seeing in most states and most counties. It's more of a demographic trend with millennials having less kids and waiting longer to have kids, but we are seeing less live births per year. But you can see that correlation with less live births in the county, creating less kindergartners 5 years later, and how that is factoring into our future analysis. We looked at our past enrollment by grade, so specifically the number of kindergartners and first grade students coming into the district. The main takeaway here is looking at these past 8 years of enrollment. We have decreased each year by around 0.5 to 2% each year for these past 8 years. Our cohort change looks at the movement of students between grades. So as a class of third graders moves into fourth grade, what's that relationship that they see grade increase versus decrease? And we have seen in these past around 10 years where we have more cohort loss year to year than new students coming into the district. So those grades that may be pretty large when they come in tend to dwindle between the years. And you can see that illustrated in this graphic for a migration. The number of new students coming into the district is those orange bars, and the number of past students that have left the district, maybe homeschool, private, parochial, even out of state, anything there that's not receiving Garden City services anymore in the green bars. So we have seen more of an out-migration than an in-migration, which is one of those limitations to enrollment growth. And then our retention analysis. So this is looking at the likelihood of kindergartners in the system this year being retained all the way through the system. So what we've seen in this 5-year analysis, that the district retains around 88.5% of our students. So as that migration and cohort change, we do see students leaving the district of around that 89% that are retained. And to put that in perspective a little bit, we pulled this table out as just kind of a snapshot of retention, where if we're looking at the 2019-20 kindergarten class, so that would be 5 years ago, year to year as they've moved through the system. They started with the 470 students, and then they've lost the 189 in those 5 years. So around a 36% decrease of students in that 5 years from that kindergarten class. So just another kind of limitation to what the district is facing with their enrollment. We have multiple different visuals that worked into the boundaries as well as the concepts. So this is looking at a count change map of our neighborhoods. Where you see orange is where the students have been growing, the number of students has increased, versus green, we've been seeing a decrease. So there's that subdivision life cycle of the likelihood of students factored into all the different neighborhoods in the district. as well as our current student density map. So looking at all the students in the district, we can really see that down in the southeast, near Victor and Alice and Charles Stones, where you can see that blob of red. That's going to be where we have the hottest student density in the district, and for elementary and middle school, where we see the most students residing. As Rob kind of talked about in this, we compared the different variables of population, housing, and enrollment growth over time to really understand that relationship. And I think this graphic is pretty powerful, just to illustrate that. Over these past 10 years, you have a community has seen population growth and you've seen housing growth, but that hasn't equated to enrollment growth. And so despite those two variables being positive, it hasn't outweighed some of the other negative variables that have caused enrollment decrease. We look at the relationship of our housing units with students. So if it's a single family yield rate or a multifamily yield rate, we know the number of students that are being generated by those housing units. And then going a little bit into just the housing market, we would look at what's the likelihood of new families moving into the district and what is that housing inventory available. So we looked at average year build, we looked at median home value, and we looked at our recent year builds, the last 5 years of our units. I'm looking around about 50 to 60 units built per year these past 5 years. To kind of put that in perspective, over time, we can see here in this graphic, kind of decade by decade, the community has built the different residential inventory, which most of those units being built within the 60s to 80s. So starting from, in this decade, 3 years, we have built 206 units. And that's to kind of give perspective of what we're looking at for the next decade, or as we finish this decade of housing growth. Meeting with the city and economic development, we've worked together to generate this map to look at where we see current active developments, that's going to be the green, and where there's maybe potential housing growth in the yellow and the purple. So different areas of where we see students potentially coming into the district in these new housing developments is going to be integrated into those projections. And the unit counts as well. And so in the current phases, we have a more firm understanding of the number of units that are being proposed. But the 5 and 10 years, it's going to kind of maybe change over time as we have more information about which projects get approved and the timeline on those. But we do try to indicate the number of potential units coming into the district. And then lastly, just like Rob said, we have a factor in the model that looks at the economic impact of future jobs in the community. So we do have one of those variables that brings in the likelihood of future population, future growth, and Empirical Foods is a great example of how that model is going to include that information. So all that information and a lot more is going to build into what you see on this screen, which is our projection model. So starting in our past data and moving to the next 5 years, we have the district decreasing by about 160 students, with the majority at that high school level. So as the largest grades are in the high school, they exit the system, not being fully replaced by the incoming grades, creating a pretty natural enrollment loss at the high school. But our different factors of housing growth and economic growth create a very stable to slightly increasing enrollment at our elementary and intermediate buildings. So that goes into just the data, so you guys have some understanding of where the projections are coming from. The next thing I'm going to go through is our committee process. So we have set this process starting past December. We've had 4 committee meetings leading into our public input tonight. And the one thing I just want to stress here is this is the process for the committee. So this is the meetings that we have scheduled with them to come together with RSP. This isn't saying that the final decision is made in May 2024, but this was the set number of meetings for the committee to work through and to provide a recommendation. At that point, it moves over to admin and board hands to do more of that deep dive and work on their team to find maybe that solution that they would approve. Our different process has many different roles, and that's just color coordinating with that visual that you guys just saw. We have a concept of ACE that wraps around this whole project that really the committee members used in a lot of discussion, which was in all of our conversations and all of our potential voting or small group callouts, we want to come back to this concept of ACE, which is the academics, culture, and economics. What is the academic success for our students in this plan? What is the culture of our facility, and what are we trying to foster with the culture of our schools? And then what is that economics, fiscal responsibility of this plan? We were provided with some guiding principles from the board that started this out. And it's really important to say that when we started this process, we were just looking at boundaries, right? We were just looking at what's a potential solution to the overflowing at Jenny Barker. And very quickly after that meeting one, this got a bit messier. We got more information, and it was very clearly that this was going to be more than just a boundary analysis. But at this point with the guiding principles, that's what we were talking about. And with that, we were able to look at boundary criteria, which is really important when we think of the final solution. We look at all 10 criteria in different data metrics to measure how a boundary concept may be better in some lenses than others. For example, maybe a plan may do the very best at creating a transportation network for the buses, but it may not balance enrollment between our facilities. So depending on your lens and your data metrics, you may like a different boundary for different reasons. Which is why we have the board at the forefront of this process prioritize our criteria. So talking with leadership and district administration, they were able to prioritize these 10 criteria into these top 3. Fiscal considerations, operational. So does this plan address our staffing concerns? What is the fiscal responsibility of the plan? Are students impacted in the boundary change? And then projected enrollment, building utilization. So starting at meeting one with the committee, they received a much more in-depth enrollment analysis than what I just gave you guys. And they were able to really talk about the data and lead into some general polling activities that talked about the different challenges in the district. And very clearly from this meeting, this was already expanded to more of the boundary committee. Which meeting 2, that's really what we focused on. We talked about the grade configuration, what would it look like if it was K5, 6, 8, what if it was K4, what was if it was K6, 7, 8, all different options with a different SWOT activity with each option, which did lead the committee to consensus that a K5, 6, 8 model would be best for our academics, our culture, our economics. At that point, we took a pause where we did meet with the board and received a bit more direct objectives from the board to help the committee work towards that solution. So on March 4th here, the board did take action that the committee was going to utilize this process to look at a grade reconfiguration to a K5, 6, 8 model and to target facility utilization of 75 to 85% at each grade level. So at meeting 3, that's what they really got. They got some 2 draft concepts that really put this on paper, and they were able to compare what the boundaries looked like in a K5, 6, 8, and to look at how would we look at building utilization and improving that. Meeting 4, we're really preparing for tonight's meeting. So we took the 2 concepts that were proposed, and depending on the different items that they liked in concept 1 and concept 2, we created the elementary hybrid concept, which is what you guys will be presented with tonight. So it's a combination of those drafts that works to better perform what the committee liked. It's not a perfect plan, and I can't say that all committee members fully support it. Right? But it's one of those things where we're at the process where we feel comfortable bringing this forward and receiving input to maybe hopefully improve the concept and continue working on this draft. So in conclusion, I just kind of talk about a little bit about how this different input built into this. So we had some committee input, we've had some board input, and last night and tonight, we're really here for the public input. So there are many different moving parts in this process. If the grade configuration change, if we look at building utilization, they're all very big items that we're hoping to try to capture and get your guys' input on. As what Rob was saying, is the juice worth the squeeze? How far do we move this needle to achieve those board objectives that were assigned to us? All right, so I'm gonna be pretty brief on this section because all this information is at your packets and at the large maps. But just to kind of do an overview of what we're presenting tonight, we have the elementary hybrid concept that looks at a K-5 elementary model for all schools and increasing the district capacity to 75 to 85%. So with that, with creating a K-5 model, we automatically have some challenges to address at our buildings. With turning Bernadine 6 and Charles Stone's in elementary schools, we needed to create boundaries for those schools, as well as some of our current schools that are on the smaller size. They didn't have the capacity to serve a K to 5th grade enrollment, as well as achieving the objective of having 75 to 85% at each grade band. This plan morphed out of the committee and district administration, where we would propose to close Georgia Matthews, Gertrude Walker, Jenny Barker, and Plymouth schools. Victor Ornelas would become the early childhood center, and this really goes into the proximity between Victor Ornelas and Charles Stone. As when you bring Charles Stone as an elementary school, the K to 5th grade can't fit in VO, and so it was a pretty natural move where we used that school for some different programming, and all of elementary students would be served in Charles Stone's. We also have the middle school concept. So if we look at 6th to 8th grade being served in our middle schools, do we look at a 1 middle school model or a 2 middle school model? So you'll see large maps throughout the room, and I do really encourage everyone to get out of their seats and walk around and look at these large maps. There's a lot of information on these. On the maps, you'll see the solid colors that illustrate the concept boundaries, and the dotted lines illustrating the current boundaries. So where the solid color extends past the dotted line is where we're proposing a change to those attendance boundaries. Some of the large maps are the current boundary with what a current K-5, 6, 8 grade level would look like. And so I really do encourage people to go look at that, because that really sets the stage of why we're here looking at the concept, where if we don't do anything to the boundaries, if we don't look at utilization of our facilities, what the situation would be in a K-5, 6, 8 model. You'll see the projection numbers for this concept that look at that utilization of our facilities as well as our district-wide. The number of students impacted in this analysis, and you can kind of think of this as a students impacted snapshot. When we're looking at our students this year, this would be our current K to 3rd grade, as in 25-26. They would be our 2nd to 5th grade. I don't know the location of our future kindergarten students, so I couldn't include them in the impact analysis. So there are more students that are potentially impacted for our future 2 years of kindergarten. But right now, this is the kind of a snapshot of what that impact would potentially look like. And then also in your packets, you have a demographic analysis, looking at the percentage of students by race and ethnicity, as well as ELL programming of what this hybrid concept would look like. For the middle schools, I put this map in your packets just to illustrate that if you're comparing a 1 middle school to a 2 middle school model, the 1 middle school boundary isn't really a boundary. Everything's blue. All the students at 6th grade could come into Horace Good. And just like the high school, it would all serve as a district as a whole. So this isn't on the large maps, but hopefully you guys can understand with the 1 middle school model, it wouldn't be distributing our students. Everyone would come together. The projection model for our middle school is on the large maps and in your tables. And so a 1 middle school concept, this was talked a lot with the committee of the different pros and cons between having 1 middle school or 2 middle schools. And this really came from having that if we do a 6th to 8th grade programming, we have to make some facility investment either way. So in this case, with a 1 middle school model, the district would be investing in Garden City Achieve building to renovate it as a 6th grade center. And that programming for JDA would move over to Kenneth Henderson. So they would serve all of 6th to 8th grade at Horace Good. In the 2 middle school concept, the district will be looking at adding an addition at Kenneth Henderson to provide enough programming space to serve 6th to 8th grade. And this is what will be at those large maps of the concept for a 2 middle school plan. In this programming model, we would be looking at a feeder alignment. So students that, depending on what elementary school you go to and where you live, you would either attend Horace Good or Kenneth Henderson. So for this conversation, we were looking at using the hybrid concept boundaries, which would create a complete feeder for all of our schools except Jenny Wilson, which would be split about 50-50 between KH and Horace Good. So in conclusion there, we have a lot of working parts that go into both of these concepts. We're really trying to illustrate how we do have our fiscal considerations utilized in our elementary concept, talk about the number of students impacted in our projected enrollment, and then for the middle school, really understanding and really wanting to hear public input on the concept of using a one middle school plan versus continuing the 2 middle schools and the different levels of investment needed for those plans. So now we're just going to move into public input. Some of these expectations, we have a lot of different ways to provide input, and we really just want to have a good conversation with everyone that participates with the presented information and your guys' different items and questions and feedback on the concepts. There's committee members throughout the room as well as our team in district administration to help answer questions and really listen to you guys. Like Rob said, there's the 3 different ways to provide input. You can have that verbal input of conversations as well as the formal public input at the end of the night. You can provide written input at the stations where there's large sticky notes and small sticky notes, if you feel more comfortable writing down your input, and we're collecting all of those to document. And then the electronic survey. So the survey, the QR codes are throughout the room. It's going to be live for the next 2 weeks, and it's going to provide a lot of information that you guys just heard from me, but for those that were not able to attend either night, provides kind of a understanding of this information to also receive input on. Like we said earlier, this process for the committee is set to end in May, but that's not when the decision is necessarily made. That's just when it moves hands over into the Board of Education and Administration. And so with that, I'm going to probably turn it back over to Dr. Dominguez to let you guys have your conversations and to work in your small groups.
All righty, thank you. If you want to have public comment, like she said, one of these ways to scan me, there's some little bubble on there you can actually write in. It's 200 characters, about a paragraph long, and that's on size 2, 3, and 4. I believe, and then you can definitely write on a sticky note, and you can definitely write on the sheets of paper. I would be remiss, Ms. Vice President Jackie Jiggett is over here to my left. Randy Ralston, Mr. Randy Ralston, board member also. You already met President John Weesey. I see Robin Bergkamp, board member. Andy Farmeyer's out there also in the purple. He's got his Wildcats going. Any other board member that I missed? And I could have definitely missed it. But at your table, there's maps out, the larger maps, there's maps in your packet, and basically we just want you to delve into it, and if you have questions and or comments, and if you have a red and green, if you have a question, those red cards will let someone know to come to you. If not, we'll just be walking around the floor, and that's it. A little bit of input at your table. Thank you.